been a minute. I'm so sorry. I figured though, instead of apologizing profusely, I would just, dive right on into the video. I can almost guarantee that every single one of us at one point or another has used a lunging aid. Whether that was side reins, a bungee, some other wild configuration that we just made up on the fly and hoped did something that we thought it was doing and probably actually never did. But regardless, we have our lunging aids that we prefer, that we like, that we'll recommend to others to use, as well as we have those that we hate and would not touch with a 10-foot pole. And for me, this has always been the Pessoa system. I have never had the urge to buy one. When I had access to one, I never had the urge to use it. I have never used the Pessoa system. And I realized, probably instead of continuing on with my unjust grudge against some random inanimate object, I should actually have a reason behind why I dislike it. Because I realized, well, yes, I don't like the Pessoa system. I actually don't have a substantial reason for my dislike. I don't have a logical, quantifiable, I can't support why I dislike it. I've just always have not liked it. This week, why not figure out if my distaste for the Pessoa system is actually warranted, or if I have just been holding an unjust grudge against an inanimate object for no reason. Anyways, first things first, whether we're for or against a piece of tech, we have to know why we would use it or why other people are using it, what's their goal, and go from there. And as far as lunging aids go, lunging aids are meant to encourage and teach a horse to stretch long and low and go slow. So it's not necessarily a performance horse slow jog. It's slow with the idea of balance in mind. Your horse is intentionally putting their feet where they're going, right? Not like a baby moose just sprawling all over the place. I look at long and low as a horse stretching over their top line, carrying their nose in front of the vertical, which sometimes can be confused with, people saying long and deep. And when I hear long and deep, I think of a horse probably still stretching over their top line, but they're carrying their nose behind vertical and hyperflexed even to a small degree. However, no lunging aid is intended to or going to teach your horse a higher level of self-carriage or collection. Part of this reason is that lunging aids are static, meaning they don't move. If you've ever taken a statics class, the answers and everything always comes out to be 0, because an example would be a book sitting on a table, right? The forces going down against the book, as well as the first forces exerted by the table against the book, cancel each other out, equaling 0, therefore the book stays stationary. So static is a system that doesn't move, where a dynamic would be a system that does move. Think about our horses. Our horses are a dynamic system. They will lengthen and shorten their frame, lengthen and shorten their stride, where our lunging aids are static. While yes, we can adjust their settings, we have to physically stop the horse, adjust the setting, and then send them back out on the circle to lunge around with it. A good example of thinking of its static nature of lunging aids is to think of, and I've done this too, don't do it anymore, but think of a time when you've over-shortened your lunging aid. So side reins is a great example, where you'll shorten them so that way at the walk or the halt, the horse is carrying themselves behind vertical. That way, when you push them up into the trot or the canter, they're carrying themselves in the head carriage that you wanted them to have. But because the system is static, it can't adjust or account for the different head carriage the horse requires at the halt and the walk. Thereby, when they move up into the trot and the canter, that system is either too loose and it creates slack, and when you're riding, you can remove the slack from your reins, but when you're lunging your horse, because it's static, you can't really remove the slack from your lunging aid. Just as if you over-tighten the lunging aid, you can't give at the halt or the walk. You have to wait until you push the horse up into a more energetic gait, such as canter or trot, where now the lunging aid no longer pulls them behind vertical. And when we look specifically at the Pessoa system itself, we see that it was invented by Nilsson Pessoa and was designed to encourage balance and slow development of top-line muscling. So it wasn't designed for a quick fix or to have a steroid. Yeah, there we go, steroid. It wasn't designed to have a steroid-esque effect on a horse's muscling, right? None of these training aids are going to be quick fixes. None of them are going to bulk your horse up overnight. They're all designed to help your horse develop slowly. And the Pessoa is a system of ropes and pulleys that attaches from the surcingle to the bit with a strap around the hindquarters. And the strap around the hindquarters, I think, is where most people kind of go after the Pessoa system for, or why they seek it out to use it in their training regimens, is because that hind strap presents the Pessoa to work on more than just the front half of the horse, right? Think of side reins. Side reins really only work on shoulders forward to the horse's mouth, right? That's really all it's acting on. If you look at the Pessoa, it's presented with this idea that it works on the entirety of your horse's body. And some people might think that it's a more dynamic lunging aid, but it's actually not. It's still relatively static in its application. It still has settings that you adjust it to, and while the horse is moving, it's not going to deviate from those settings that it's set on. Settings that it's set on? Does that make sense? And when we look at the research available on Pessoas, there was a nice change for once that they actually had more than like 2 studies that looked at how it works, how it's affecting our horses' bodies in different ways. And while there's still questions I had at the end that weren't answered, I felt like I got kind of a lot better of an understanding of how the Pessoa works. And so the first study we're going to take a look at is called A Preliminary Study into the Use of Infrared Thermography as a Means of Assessing the Horse's Response to Different Training Methods. Their goal in this study was to use infrared thermography to determine how the Pessoa system affected a horse's stress response during a lunging session. They used 8 riding school horses who had previously been lunged in the Pessoa, which I thought was actually really cool because a lot of times when they do these kind of studies, they use horses that have never had experience with a certain training aid or training method. That way they have a blank slate that they're comparing against, and they get, I guess, as much as authentic as reaction as possible. But I really like that they used horses that have already encountered the Pessoa system and are regularly using it, because I think it's a lot more applicable, the results they got from this, to apply to our horses, that we would be using the Pessoa regularly throughout training regimens, and that your horse's stress response to the Pessoa is going to be different from the very first time you use it to like a regular session and then after they've been using it for a few months. So I was really glad to see they used horses that have already experienced and regularly work in the Pessoa. Each horse in this study was lunged twice for 15 minutes per session, once with the Pessoa and once without it. The lunging session occurred on both reins, and they went from walk, trot, canter, trot, walk. They left the Pessoa system fitted loosely until the second trot, where they tightened it to the mid, or like the next setting up, so it was mid-level, I think, at shoulder height was what it was adjusted to. They took temperatures of the eyes, ear, neck, and core for each gait with and without the training aid. What they found was that there was no significant difference with either the training aid on the gait of the horse or on the temperature of the ear and neck, which I think you could kind of guess, right? I didn't think the Pessoa would have an effect on ear or neck temperature. Where they did find a difference was with eye temperature. When the horses were wearing the Pessoa system, eye temperature increased from 83.6 degrees Fahrenheit without it to 87 degrees Fahrenheit when they were wearing the Pessoa, which is a 4-degree change. And I was a little bit surprised by a 4-degree change, because previously when I looked at studies that evaluated how tight nosebands affected horses and their stress response, or tight bridles, ill-fitting tack, they also measured eye temperature in horses. And frequently the eye temperature they would say was a significant difference would be from 1 to 2 degree change. So I thought it was really interesting to see that this had a 4-degree change in eye temperature. And the reason why eye temperature is such a significant place to measure, especially when it comes to stress level in horses, is that it has been shown that increased eye temperature has a positive correlation with increased levels of cortisol, and cortisol is the stress hormone in horses. I'm guessing there's probably other stress hormones out there, but the main stress hormone they focus on in these studies is cortisol. They also noted that there was a higher core temperature with the Pessoa system being 98.8 degrees Fahrenheit compared to without the Pessoa, which was 98 degrees Fahrenheit. The only thing that I have about that is I don't really know how core temperature relates to stress in the horse's body, and they didn't really go into that. So where I would look at the difference in core temperature, I would guess is probably more along the lines that the horses were using their core muscles more when they were wearing the Pessoa, and that was what was increasing the temperature, as well as it was a 0.8 degree change, which just barely under 1 degree, but at the same time, I don't know how relevant that is to the stress level in a horse. They concluded that horses experienced more stress while wearing the Pessoa system than without it, which to me, honestly, makes sense, right? If you look at the difference in eye temperature, knowing that an increase in eye temperature has a positive correlation with increase in cortisol levels, I would have been really interested if they had swabbed the horse and measured their actual cortisol levels to see how much it increased with the Pessoa system being used, is that massive change in eye temperature would indicate that the horses were experiencing more stress. The only thing is, not necessarily is all stress bad stress, so it's hard to measure that. And I think I would be really interested to see if people started applying a range of eye temperature and cortisol levels. That way we could know, what does cortisol levels look like when the horse's eye temperature is at this level? What does it look like when the horse's eye temperature increases to this? How drastically does that cortisol rise? I'd be really interested if they started giving a range. And I think that's something I'm going to have to start looking into on my own. That way I don't know, we have a better understanding of it and aren't misrepresenting any of this information. But now kind of switching away from stress reactions to the Pessoa, the other really big part of the Pessoa is how does it affect our horse's muscles, right? I mean, the big reason why people are using it is not to induce our horses in stress, but is to activate their muscle. And people use it to help build our horses' top lines. They use it in rehab programs. So this study is called The Effects of Training Aids on the Longissimus dorsi in the Equine Back. This was published in March 2009, and their goal was to determine if side reins and the Pessoa system increase the use of the longissimus dorsi when horses are being lunged. And now, before we go any further, we should probably break down what the longissimus dorsi is. That way we're not just throwing around like really big technical terms and we're all confused in general with it, because trust me, I get confused when I'm reading through these studies and I just throw around technical term, and I'm like, that has so many syllables in it, I don't know what to do. But essentially, the longissimus dorsi is the largest muscle in the horse's back, playing an important role in extending the horse's back and flexing their spine laterally. An increased use of this muscle would indicate stabilization of the back. So increased activity of the longissimus dorsi indicates greater engagement of the hind limbs and strengthening of the horse's trunk muscles, which is what the Pessoa system aims to do. They lunged 9 horses under 4 different conditions. They measured them first without any lunging aid, which they use as their control group. So they measure what the horse's muscles were doing without any outside impacts or factors affecting their muscles. They then moved on to measuring with the Pessoa using the entire training aid. They measured it with the Pessoa using only the back straps. The 4th condition was the horse wearing side reins. They use electromyographic and speed measurements to analyze around 100 strides per trial that were like the most uniform, but overall they actually measured about 1,500 strides of each horse per trial. What they found was that neither side reins nor the Pessoa system increased the use of the longissimus dorsi to stabilize the back. They did know that there was a significant increase in the longissimus dorsi on the inside of a turn, but not increased when the Pessoa or side reins were applied. In fact, what they noted was that the highest activity in the longissimus dorsi was noted when they weren't wearing any training aids, and the lowest activity of this muscle was when they were wearing the Pessoa system. They also noted there was an impact on the reduction of stride duration while wearing side reins and the Pessoa. The walk had a reduction of 0.7 to 1.2% in stride duration, and the trot saw a reduction of 2.3%. They also noted that along with this shorter stride, when the training aids were applied, the horses also shortened their neck. And they commented on the horse's head and neck angle changing, which was wider without the training aid and then became more closed when the training aids were applied. And they suspected that perhaps this change in head angle would be impacting how the horses were using their longissimus dorsi, how they were using their back. But once again, it's not really a surprise that the horse's head and neck angle changed when you applied a training aid. Obviously, without the training aid on, they're going to carry themselves a little bit differently than they would with a training aid that actively works at helping them carry themselves correctly or changing their head carriage. Their final conclusions of this study were that training aids did not promote the greatest activity in the longissimus dorsi, and it could be argued that simply lunging the horse would increase activity and that could help strengthen the muscle. The one caveat that I would say is to just kind of take some of this information with a grain of salt. Many of these training aids and rehabilitation programs strive to increase large muscle group activity. There's actually been minimal research and investigation into whether or not there's a positive correlation between increased muscle activity and these muscles growing stronger. There has been a few cases where scientists have used electromyography to measure muscle activity and how it occurs in different exercises. And then they rank these different exercises on effectiveness, and they would rank those that had the higher level of muscle activity as most effective, while those that had lower muscle activity as least effective. So it suggests that there is a positive correlation between muscle activity and muscles becoming stronger, it's just not a relationship that has been thoroughly investigated. So I don't think it makes the results of this study invalid. I just think it's something worth noting, that way you don't feel like you're being misled. And then the third study that I will briefly touch on and then move on to kind of like our final thoughts and everything is one that's called The Effects of the Pessoa Training Aid on Temporal, Linear, and Angular Variables of Working Trot. They had this study broken into kind of two different parts. The first part, they lunged 4 different horses in a Pessoa and without the Pessoa, and what they were trying to measure was, did it matter, were results changed if you lunged the horse first in the Pessoa and then lunged them without it, versus lunging them without the Pessoa and then lunging them in it? You know, would that skew the results? Did you have to use it in a certain pattern? And what they found was that it didn't really matter. So going forward into the next part of their study, where they measured 12 different horses, they lunged them first without the lunging aid, and then they used them with the lunging aid, which is how the Pessoa system is recommended to be used, is that you warm up without it first, and then you use it. So they took 12 horses, lunged them on a 16-meter circle with and without the Pessoa. They used high-speed motion capture and inertial measurements, and they evaluated the video to determine what was what at the end. What they found was that there was a significant decrease in speed, stride length, and head angle, which I think would be applicable, right? That's kind of what we would expect to see. And I would suggest that decrease in speed would be the horse probably balancing themselves more, as well as decrease in stride length. I don't know if that's a more balanced stride. It's definitely not a decreased stride length in terms of collection. It's probably just a general decrease in stride length, as well as a decrease in head angle would be due to now they have something acting on a bit in their mouth and aren't just going to be able to poke their nose out and run around the end of the circle. There's also a decrease in the lumbosacral angle, which is a good thing. That indicates that they're engaging their hind end and changing that back angle to now step all the way underneath themselves and hopefully engage their core. But they noted that there was no difference in the flexion of the horse's joints. It goes back to my previous statement, you cannot use this system to teach your horse a higher level of collection. Another important difference that they noted was that without the Pessoa, the highest point of the horse was their poll. When they applied the Pessoa training aid, the highest point of the horse was the crest of their neck. And I know growing up, I was always taught that highest point of your horse should always be their poll. When their poll is lower than their neck or their crest, that indicates that now something's falling apart. They're probably behind vertical, hyperflexed to even a small degree. You know, as soon as a horse is behind vertical, they're slightly hyperflexed. So their final conclusions were that the Pessoa may be beneficial for general training and rehabilitation. Notice they say general training, not, excessively cranking a horse's head in with it or teaching them at the next level of self-carriage, as well as if you use it as a method to improve posture and stimulate core muscle activation, that's where you're going to see the best results. Because it does not increase the loading of limbs, it is a good use of tool for rehabbing horses with different injuries. So to kind of wrap up our research, there's still probably a couple other studies out there that I didn't really look too deeply into or talk about, because while they do pop up when you're looking into research behind the Pessoa training aid, they actually aren't looking necessarily at the Pessoa. They just kind of discuss it later in the discussion portion of the research while they were actually looking at something else. One of these that pops up constantly is the study that's called Effect of a 4-Week Elastic Resistance Band Training Regimen on Back Kinematics in the Horses Trotting in Hand and on the Lunge. And they looked at 7 horses that were in a rehab program at week 1 and then at week 4, where they incorporated elastic resistance bands into the horse's rehab program. And they measured the degree of back movement with the hopes that by week 4, the muscles would be stronger and stabilizing the back. And while they were not specifically looking at the Pessoa system in this rehab program, they did talk about it a little bit at the end and compare it to the resistance bands they were using. And they explained that the Pessoa system has a similar effect, where the resistance bands, as well as the Pessoa, increase the lumbosacral angle, which indicates that it would be good and beneficial to use in a rehab program. What they did note also as well when they were talking about the Pessoa in comparison to resistance bands was that they were inclined to use resistance bands instead of the Pessoa, because resistance bands do not have a direct connection to the horse's bit or the mouth, where the Pessoa system does. And that connection in the Pessoa system has been part of its kind of drawbacks or downfalls, in that it can create inconsistent pressure, inconsistent contact in the bit. There was another study that looked at local back pressure caused by a training roller during lunging with and without a Pessoa training aid. And the reason they are looking into the differences in pressure beneath a surcingle when using the Pessoa versus not using it is because the Pessoa is so kind of entwined with rehab and is commonly used in that manner, is they wanted to see, you know, what kind of impacts would it have on a horse that you're trying to rehab in the back. And they noted that because the Pessoa causes an increase in pressure beneath the surcingle, that if you're trying to rehab an injury that falls near where the surcingle would sit or where the surcingle would disperse pressure, that the Pessoa would not be a good option to use in those instances. So I guess that would leave us asking, you know, okay, cool. That was all a bunch of convoluted information. What does that mean, right? Because that's where I feel like I'm at the end of one of these videos. I've done all the research, so I know what I'm talking about, but I can't imagine how confusing it is to just hear me spewing all this stuff at you, and you're like, ah, right? And when I got to the end of all this research and studies on the Pessoa system, I was happy to see how much looked into it and looked at how different muscles are working when we're using these types of training aids, because that's what they're aiming to do. But I was also frustrated on there's like two avenues that I wish I had seen just one study looking into. The first one being that no one looked at how the Pessoa impacts the pressure of the bit, right? This has been a major drawback or turnoff factor for me whenever I look at the Pessoa, and I think this is honestly where my distaste has come from for it. The hind limb strap on the Pessoa, while it does connect to the surcingle, it also has a connection to that bit. And so every time a horse takes a stride forward, the strap can pull against the horse's hind limbs, and that creates spikes in pressure on the bit and inconsistent contact. Even though some people have tried to come up with their own ways of kind of superseding that little hiccup in the Pessoa system, or they've tried to come up with their own ways and like devices that will not make that happen, it still occurs to a small degree. And while these spikes in pressure may be minimal with a looser setting, it also increases the higher setting that you put the Pessoa system on. And that inconsistent spike in pressure caused by the breeching strap is something that really heavily deters me from it. So I would have loved to see a study that looked into the changes in bit pressure, because I think that has a really big change in how some people might perceive this training aid. The other area that no one really looked into that I wish they had was with how do the horse's muscles and muscle activity change depending on which setting you put the Pessoa on. They talk about how the horses, you know, their head angle changed, and they also talk about different muscle activity when they applied this training aid, that certain areas, certain angles were increasing the horse, engaging their hind end at times, but also was a lack of muscle activity along general horse's top line. So I would love to see how that changes based on different settings on the Pessoa, right? And even though most of this research was kind of, you know, either level, the Pessoa really didn't make a difference, or was a little positive in regards to rehab, I still personally won't be using a Pessoa. To me, if I'm going to be using the Pessoa, I'd probably be using it with the idea of the benefits of that hind end breeching strap, and I can get the same effects without directly impacting the bit by using, you know, a resistance band or a hind end butt wrap. I do actually have a lunging aid that I prefer, but I realize, you know, before I'm willing to back it up and support it to other people out there, I should probably figure out if it actually does what it does. I'm also really sorry if I went too into depth with some of the information, or if you felt that like I summarized it too much or broke it down too much. I tried really hard to break this information down to be easily digestible. That way, you know, you can listen to this and actually understand what it says, because for me, I have to read some of these studies like 3 different times to actually understand the technical jargon that they're like throwing in your face. And so I don't want to break it down too much, because I don't want anyone to feel like I'm misinterpreting or misrepresenting the information, as well as I don't want anyone to feel like I'm misleading them. I've read articles that have completely lied about the results of these research. There's been like various studies about how like bit versus non-bitless works, that like the horse.com has totally misrepresented their articles and like have totally misquoted research studies. So I don't want anyone to feel like I'm misleading you or anything. I actually always post all the links that I use in the description box below this video. So if you want to go check them out, look into these studies on your own, I highly recommend doing that. You know, go form your own opinion. Don't just listen to me babbling on. And on that note, thank you guys so much for sticking with me through this video. If you have more stuff that you're curious about, if you want to know about treeless versus treed saddles, go listen to my podcast. It's called In the Barn, and me and my sister talk about different stuff, as well as like we do research on the different products that we talk about and break down. And I don't know, we have fun with it, so if you are interested, go check it out. If you guys have topics that you want me to do next, leave a comment down below, as well as if you have any questions. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always hit me up. I'm open. I'm an open book. Actually, I'm an open book, but it's more like a picture book, and there's really only one chat. Bye guys, see you next time. Whether that's in a week or a month, we don't know.